For this video, I'm going to show you a brief tutorial on how we can combine some of the fixation variables that we pulled from BGAze into dependent measures that we would analyze like in SPSS or other statistical analysis program. So what I have here is a file that contains information from the image pairs that we used in our samples protocol from a couple of weeks ago, which consists of 21 image pairs, emotional neutral image pairs, either happy neutral, disgust neutral, or sad neutral. And what I have here, so what BGAze does is it actually exports out data into a text file, and this text file I've converted into an Excel workbook. And what we have here are some information in the columns related to what actual information I pulled from BGAze, so the trial name or the trial number, the stimulus name, the AOI name, and then the two fixation variables that we really care about are the entry time variable and fixation time. The entry time indicates the amount of time it took a participant to first fixate within the particular region of interest, and then the total fixation time, the amount of time the participant, when fixated, they were fixated within that particular region. Okay, so what you see here for this first trial is we have three separate rows for each area of interest. So the neutral area of interest, so here neutral R refers to the neutral face that was on the right side of the screen, happy face that was on the left side, and then white space actually just denotes anything that's off the defined AOI. So in this case, it's the black background on each of those images. Okay, and then with the entry time, we can see here that it took about a little over a second to fixate on the neutral AOI for this participant, a little over 350 milliseconds to fixate on the happy AOI. And then within the fixation time, about 900 milliseconds or close to 900 milliseconds fixated on the neutral AOI, over a second and a half fixated on the happy AOI, and then about 325 milliseconds off on the black background. Okay, so this is within the 3 seconds that the stimuli were on the screen. Okay, so what I've done for you, just for ease of navigating through this workbook, is I've color-coded all of the trials based on the emotional type that was contained with them. So the happy trials are denoted in yellow, disgust trials denoted in green, and then the sad trials denoted in orange. And over here on the right-hand side is I've created variable names for all the formulas that we're going to calculate. And I'll briefly walk through which those are going to entail. Okay, so the hap emo and hap neut, for instance, refers to the happiness trial emotional face, happiness trial neutral face, and what I'm going to put here are going to be fixation percentages. So the percent fixation to the happy AOI relative to total fixation for anywhere on the screen, and then also for the neutral AOI over here. And what this 10 refers to is the actual T trial number that we use for deer coding. So T10, trial 10, T28, trial 28, etc. Okay, this next variable is going to be a ratio score. So basically it's going to look at the kind of preference of looking at the emotional relative to the neutral face. So it's basically combining information from these two variables into one, indicating were people looking more towards the emotional, or in this case the happy AOI for this trial, relative to the neutral. And then finally, whether or not the participant's first fixation fell within the emotional relative to the neutral AOI. Okay. So what I've put for you here in columns G through H is first a simple just denotation of the number of trials that we have for each emotion type. So 7 happy, 9 sad, and 5 disgust. There's no reason for this breakdown. It was just a random, assortment of trials that I had just culled when we were creating this practice protocol. And then some aggregate variables over here for happy ratio, sad ratio, and disgust ratio averages across the total number of trials, so the average fixation ratio for all 7 happy trials, all 9 sad trials, and all 5 disgust trials. And then finally, the probability of the first fixation falling within the emotional AOI for each of the image pairs based on trial type. So basically we're looking at over the total number of 7 trials, how many of those 7 trials did participants fixate first towards the emotional, in this case, happy face. And then we can create then a proportion of the actual probability of the first fixation landing on the emotional AOI. Alright, so let me briefly walk through how we actually get each of these formulas. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Excel, these are very simple formulas to create, and if you just follow along with the directions that I have here, they should be easy to translate. And those for you experienced with Excel, this will be probably a very nice refresher for you. Okay, when we're creating formulas, the first thing we always want to do is type in the equal sign. All right. So again, like I said, what I'm going to be doing here is calculating a fixation percentage. So it's going to be the amount of time fixated on this particular AOI relative to anywhere else on the screen. So in order to do that, I'm going to start out with 2 left parentheses, and I'm going to put in the cell name that corresponds to the happy AOI. And in this case, it's going to be E3, so happy L fixation time. So I'll type in E3, close the first parenthesis, divided by the sum of all 3 AOIs. So I can either left click my mouse and then just drag down to highlight all 3 of those cells, or I can just type in E2 colon E4. Close that parentheses, and then I'm going to close the entire parentheses so that it encapsulates the entire formula. Okay, and I hit enter, and that's the fixation percentage. So when fixated, participants spent 57% of the time fixated on the happy face relative to the neutral. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing for the neutral AOI. Equal sign, double parentheses. Now this time I'm going to be using E2 for the neutral AOI in my numerator. Close the parentheses, divided by, again, the sum of E2 through E4. Close the parentheses, close the full formula. Okay, and so now 31% of the time this participant was fixated on the neutral AOI. Now what I want to do is I want to create a ratio score to indicate, how far away from 0 as an even point is this participant looking at the emotional relative to the neutral AOI. So this ratio bias score ranges from 1 to -1. Closer to 1 indicates a preference toward the emotional image. -1 indicates a preference towards the neutral image. Okay, so if you have a value that's greater than 1 or less than -1, you did an incorrect calculation here. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at the difference between the 2 AOIs in the numerator and the summation of those 2 AOIs in the denominator. So click on equals, left parentheses. I'm going to type in J2 to correspond to the happy emo percentage minus K2 for the neutral percentage, and parentheses, divided by the summation of those 2, J2 plus K2. Click and enter, and see that the ratio score is positive. It's greater than 0. Indicates that the fixation to the emotional AOI, so the happy face, was greater than fixation to the neutral face. Now if I would have had a negative value here, I probably did the calculation wrong, and I'd want to go back and recheck that. Okay. Last formula that we want to calculate is an indication of where the participant looked first relative to the 2 AOIs. So we're going to get into column D here, and these 2 values here. Okay. So the smaller value is going to indicate where the participant actually looked first relative to the 2 AOIs, because it was a shorter time from the time the trial started to when the participant's first fixation was deployed on that image. So since this value was smaller, the participant actually did look at the happy AOI first, and it took longer for them to look at the neutral AOI next. Okay, so what we do here is we create a formula that just indicates through a binary code 0 or 1 where that first fixation fell. So this time we're going to use a conditional formula through an if-then statement. So we'll click on equals, if for if, left parentheses. And what we're going to do here is we're going to type in the entry time for the emotional AOI first. So in this case, it's D3. And then D2 for the neutral AOI. Okay, so what this indicates right here is if D3, the emotional AOI entry time, is greater than D2, so if this value here, 357, is greater than D2, which it's not, what that indicates is that we would put a 0 in this cell, okay? Indicating that the fixation was actually toward the neutral AOI first, the first fixation toward the neutral AOI relative to the emotional. However, if it's the converse, if D3 is actually less than D2, which is the case here with this example, the formula puts in 1 into this cell. Okay? So if D3 greater than D2, comma, quotation 0, quotation, comma, quotation 1, quotation, and parenthesis. Okay? Since this value, 357.4, is actually less than 1191.7, we should get a 1 in this cell. We click enter, and that's actually the case. Okay, so you can do a double check to make sure that the formula was calculated correctly based on the size of these two values. Right? If the entry time for the emotional AOI, wherever that emotional AOI might be, is smaller than the entry time for the neutral AOI, this first fixation value should always be 1. Okay, so that's how you calculate all 4 formulas, and you do the same thing for the remainder of the trials, so the remainder 20 of the trials. Okay, once you've calculated all 4 of those values, what you're going to do now is you're going to aggregate a total kind of average or proportion for the ratio score variable and the first fixation variable. Okay, so for the happy, sad, and disgust ratio averages, you're just going to simply type in one formula, $average, parentheses, all of the happiness ratio values. So you click on, hap 10 ratio, you would scroll over to hap 58 ratio. Oops, I screwed up there. One thing that you need to do is when you click on the first one, you also want, if you're on a PC, do a control left click so that it highlights all of those cells. If you're on a Mac, it's a command left click. Okay. 62 hap ratio, 11 hap ratio, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so you would do all 7 of those and the parentheses, and then just click enter. Okay. Do the same for sad and disgust. Now for the happy first fixation percentage, or proportion I should say, you're going to do an equals sum, and then sum out all of the first fixation variables, so 10 hap, 58, 62, 11, etc., etc., etc. Close the parentheses and then divide by 7. Okay, since there were 7 happy trials, you want to get the proportion out of the total number of trials. You would do the same summation for sad, but divide by 9, and disgust, but divide by 5. Okay. All right, and then that's it. So if you have any questions on how to go through this protocol, let me know. You can stop by my office, send me an email, or if there's any other troubleshooting things or additional information that you're curious about with regard to this brief tutorial. Okay. What I'd like for you to do is I want you to save this file somewhere where you can have access to it, and what we'll do when we reconvene next week is to just kind of walk through and go over, make sure everybody got the correct percentages, got the correct proportion for each of the 3 trial types, and to answer any questions that you might have at that time as well. All right, Good luck.